Hello, everybody, and welcome back to days 58 to 63 of the 100 Days of Making Comics Challenge. So, today I wanted to share some tips and tricks and just a little advice that I have learned through other comics creators and also through my own experience of making my comic. How to save time doing it, because if you haven't found out already, making comics is a very time consuming thing. Every page is anywhere from 1 to 9 illustrations, and depending on your art style, that might mean that a whole page takes you 2 to 3 to 4 weeks to do. So there are a few things that you can do and keep in mind so that you're not spending 20 years on one story, because that can happen. So, the first one that I feel like is the most obvious is that you should be familiar with the tools at your disposal and the ways you can use them in order to take shortcuts. Because unlike a painting and the fine arts, your end product is not one single picture or illustration or painting or anything. It's not one of those. So spending all of your time and effort on one of the thousands of illustrations that you'll be doing every single time you make an illustration for your comic it's almost unthinkably terrible to do. Like, just imagining having to put all of the time and effort that I spend on my full-scale paintings and illustrations into every single panel of my comic would make my hand cramp in sympathy, but also just my whole body would cringe in horror. I think maybe I'd drop dead after like 5 pages of that. It's just not something that is advisable. So taking shortcuts wherever you can is absolutely necessary and suggested, recommended by I'm fairly confident in saying every single professional comics creator, manga creator would say that you should take shortcuts. So learning the ways that you can take shortcuts is definitely step one. If you're a traditional comics creator, then that would mean figuring out if using like rulers or stencils or anything like those would help you save time, especially if you're doing, especially if there's something in your comics that shows up over and over and over again. Creating a template or a stencil or a stamp or a method in drawing it that would save you time, so you don't have to hand draw it all over again every single time it shows up, would be like awesome. I currently in chapter 1 of my comic, The Forgotten Ones, I don't believe that there's any kind of like pattern or anything where I can like have just an image file that I can lay over it and like transform and manipulate as I see fit in order to make it look like I drew it. But if you're a digital artist, that's definitely something that you can do, is using brushes. This is where you can really save time. Brushes, not just for textures, but for objects as well. Vegetation brushes for trees and bushes and flowers and grass are your best friend, because not only will it allow you to keep your style consistent throughout your project, but also it saves you time, so you don't have to fiddle with anything. You can just use a clone stamping, you can use copy paste, you can use brushes. You figuring out your illustration program and the tools that it gives you in order to make things go faster, like the paint bucket tool for filling in the flat colors if you're doing that. Just like okay, I'm going to give you a recommendation. On YouTube, there is a Japanese produced documentary series called Manben, Manben. It, like, I think only last month was when it stopped being available, like, on YouTube on one single channel, the Manben channel. I don't know what happened because I had all of their videos saved. I watched like half of them before they all went private, but people have been uploading them. They're like hour-long documentaries, and it's of the manga scene in Japan, and they go into mangakas, their studios, and they set up cameras and they record them for a day doing their whole process, and then they watch the footage back with the host and the mangaka of that episode, and they talk about, the things that they do and the ways that they produce their manga and their style and all of that. And it's so not only inspiring, but it's also so illuminating on how these creators are so prolific, because really when you think about how many pages these people produce a month just so that they can get an issue out on time, it's mind-boggling. Like, some of them do like 100 pages a day, and they have, like anywhere from 2 to 10 assistants depending on how much they need produced for a single issue. But a lot of these mangaka are like doing the line art illustrations for every panel, for every page, and then their assistants are the ones who are filling in the flat blacks or the colors or the screen tones and all of that. So though they have assistants, they're still doing a large and time-consuming part of the manga creation process, which is storyboarding and then, thumbnailing and actually sketching and line arting the pages themselves. So there's like 3 seasons, and it is in Japanese, but if you turn on closed captioning, the closed captions are very good. So you should go check that out. You should check that out so that you can, see how these industry professionals are taking their shortcuts, because they really don't hold back. There is no shame in showing how they use screen tone templates for like a moon, when there's just a lot of moons that show up in their manga, and so they just print out a screen tone picture and they slap it on the page, because there's really no point in recreating that moon every single time when there is very little to be gained for it. You could say, oh, I hand drew this whole graphic novel, this whole comic, this whole manga, that I took no shortcuts, nothing, and people will be like, oh, okay, that's cool, but it took you 10 years, and that could have been 10 years where people were enjoying your story, and it was out there for years and gaining traction and all of that. And so you really, 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 really should look at the way that you work and what you work with, and assess it and ask yourself, how can I do this faster? Can I combine materials? Can I combine processes? Can I take shortcuts on how I sketch or how I thumbnail or how I script or how I color? Like, what can I do so that I can get this done as fast as possible? And another one of those things that you can do is, and this is something that is like, you don't think about it, and you never really, it doesn't come to mind until you're desperate for a shortcut, and then you think of it and you go, why have I ever done it any other way? And that is, you do not have to fully illustrate every single panel, and that mainly concerns the background. Because what you should do is have a panel at the beginning of a scene that shows where your characters are and what that looks like, and setting the scene and then the tone. And then if you never draw a single background for that entire scene, and you still, like, if your characters move around, you still establish where they should be within that scene well enough, your readers won't notice, really. They won't notice, they really won't care, unless the room and space they're in is important to the story at that time. They won't notice, they won't care. Do not draw a background in every single panel, because you'll want to die. Especially if you're inside a house and there's a lot of foreground, background, middle ground stuff going on. And related to that, you shouldn't give 100% of your effort into every single panel, just full stop. Something that I've had to train myself to do, because I was an illustrator before I started drawing comics, so I taught myself art, and I established my art workflow through single illustrations, which meant that I spent 9 hours perfecting a single pose, a single color palette, a single lighting source, a single bit of anatomy. Like, I only had one picture to draw, and so I spent all of my time and effort on that single picture. But when it comes to comics, that isn't feasible, like I said before. So I had to teach myself to just let it go. Like, if there was something about a pose or a bit of anatomy that I find myself fiddling with, and I'm, erasing and redrawing and erasing and redrawing, I have to make myself stop, look at it and say, would anyone but me really truly notice this to the point where it bothers them so much that they don't read my comic? And I find myself answering no. No, nobody will really notice this eye is slightly wonky in this one tiny panel, because they won't be looking at that eye. They will be looking at the whole picture, and they won't even be looking at that whole picture for long enough to really process any of the mistakes, even if it is a big mistake. And if they do, then it'll be just a passing, like, oh, that eye is a little wonky, and then they'll keep going. Because what really matters is the overall look of your comic, and not what any individual panel has in it. So, that's basically like the big ones. I probably if I like sat down and wrote out a list could go into way more details, but it's really just like those big tips that really help you in making your comic faster, because it's definitely something worth thinking about, worth fixing, not necessarily fixing, but adjusting to your workflows. It will make you not just better at doing it faster, but better in general, because when you start taking shortcuts, you start figuring out the essentials of things. Like, if you dedicate yourself to drawing bodies every single day, like people every single day in hyperrealism, there's absolutely no shortcuts that you can take because it's hyperrealism. You have to make them look like a picture every single time. But if you're doing a simplified style, a Western graphic novel style of drawing people, or an anime style, that in itself is taking a shortcut instead of, drawing a hyper-realistic person every time. And when you start doing a simplified art style like that, then you start simplifying the shapes of the human body, the forms, the features that are absolutely necessary in order to convey that it is a person. And that lets you be more aware of the necessary and essential forms in other things, and you'll be able to convey those things better than if you were just copying it hyper realistically from a reference photo, which, if that's what you're going for, is there's nothing wrong with that, but simplifying things, trying to identify the absolutely necessary parts of a thing will make you better at drawing it, especially later on if you do decide to do it more realistically, more hyper realistically. Did that make sense? I hope so. Now I'm just rambling. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at _monista_. I post, extra sketches and illustrations and behind the scenes progress shots of my comic on my Instagram. My Twitter is more for just like personal things, not really having to do with art. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you later.